Welcome back to the Black Table on the Black Star Network. This is our weekly hour devoted to exploring ideas and subjects of special importance to people of African descent and others fighting to build a better society. I'm your regular host, Greg Carr, and in response to last week's conversation with our regular legal roundtable, Professors Angela Porter of American University, Washington College of Law, and Professor Valethia Watkins of Howard University, we thought we would schedule an extending conversation based on last week's show. Our producers thought that it would be good to respond to that popular demand. And so we're back with our legal roundtable to discuss part 2 of our court watch, not only in the wake of the affirmative action case that we heard discussed before, and in the wake of our previous legal roundtable where we looked at the court's fall docket, but now that we have survived this week's midterm elections, in the words of the great Dr. Frank Smith, the director of the African American Civil War Museum here in Washington, D.C., all these elections have helped us understand is how we must now adjust our continuing struggle. We must keep our eyes on the prize and hold on. So welcome back, Professors Porter, Professors Watkins, and let's continue our conversation that we began last week.
Hello. Hello. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Good to see you. We know that the primary response in many ways to oppression is resistance. And we know that we have been here before. And I'll maybe say a few more words about that later when we clear the table. But, you know, where we left off last Friday, you all helped us walk through the affirmative action conversation we were having around the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard in North Carolina. And there were several other cases that you mentioned and some others that you didn't get a chance to mention, including a couple that were heard this week. The oral arguments were heard this week that were of particular interest. And we were hoping that we could spend maybe the back end, the last 2 segments of today, talking about what all of this means and how we should be thinking about this in terms of how we should respond to the changing field of motion in the federal courts. But before we do that, maybe we could spend the rest of this session and the next section of our show today talking about some of the cases that you all see on the dockets that are should be of particular interest to all of us, particularly the Black folk. Any thoughts from either one of you on what we have really approaching us now?
Well, I guess I'll start.
Okay.
So one of the big cases that's coming up, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again, is Moore v. Harper. And this is a voting rights case, essentially. And it proffers what is called the independent state legislature theory, which there's a lot of buzz about, and is definitely going to uniquely impact our people if it is taken up by the court. That theory essentially asserts that the only entity that can control and check state elections is the state legislature, not state courts, the legislature alone. Now, courts are generally a check and balance on the legislature when it's up to no good, when it's doing some trickery, like things like gerrymandering. This is a partisan gerrymandering case, but that still affects Black people because we typically vote in a block based on party. And so typically the courts get involved. And we saw that in the 2000 election, Bush v. Gore. Typically the state courts are the check on things like partisan gerrymandering, but this theory will remove them from the equation, thereby making state legislatures an unchecked body in state elections. And by the way, when I'm referencing what state legislatures do, I mean they draw the maps for elections. And it's not just state elections, it's congressional elections. So US Congress is chosen based on these state drawn maps. So this, I mean, we definitely need to talk about this more, but that's sort of a primer to start us off.
You know, it's interesting that you talk about it in that context, Angie, because again, we just had a federal election, and we see the changed map, the environment we're facing now, and a lot of people might think, "Wow, this is unprecedented. There's no precedent for this." But in fact, this is the cycle of our continuing struggle in this country. I mean, we know after the Civil War, there was a brief period of Reconstruction when there were the most progressive state legislatures wrote the most progressive state constitutions. And then there was the redemption movement, as we know. And then, of course, followed by Jim Crow. And there was a period, whether it be regular elections, whether it be attempts to gerrymander, suppress the vote, there was a 70 or 80-year period when time stopped for Black people, particularly in the South. And then there was a civil rights movement to fight. And then in the wake of that civil rights movement, as you all narrated a couple of roundtables ago, there's been this long clawback. In fact, you gestured toward it talking about affirmative action when you talked about the Warren Court, then the Burger Court, and this increasing erosion of everything from voting rights to voter suppression to dealing with the indigenous people of this country. And so, Professor Watkins, I know you spent a lot of time in the 19th century, studying the 19th century. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this Moore versus Harper case to be argued in the first week of December, and how it fits of a piece of this long fight against democracy, this anti-democratic nature, not only perhaps even of the Supreme Court, as we talked about last week, but also at the level of the states. And what does this case pretend in your mind to this long, now 50-year attempt to either overturn the Voter Rights Act, to put gerrymandering at the heart of a strategy to preserve states' rights, to suppress people's vote? I mean, does an independent state legislature in a place like the old Confederacy run by white nationalists, does that have any impact if there's no check on them, as Professor Watkins said, I'm sorry, Professor Porter said, as Angie said, at the state Supreme Court level, if there's no check on them, how might that impact their ability to suppress votes in these states and maybe lock in minority rule for a generation?
Yes, let's first go back to the point that the independent state legislature claim, it's called a theory, but it's a claim. It is a radical, extreme, fringe ideal that is going to ignore almost 2 centuries of established law. So it is a concentration of power in the hands of the state legislature, unchecked. And the state legislatures, the vast majority of them are controlled by the Republican Party. Now, the roots of that theory goes back to, or that claim goes back to Bush versus Gore in the 2000 election that the Supreme Court handed the presidency to George Bush and told the state court of Florida, the Supreme Court, to stop counting the ballots. But this is even a new era, and it's worse because it's 2 tracks. This is a continuation of the attempt of what happened in January 6th. That was the electors track, dealing with the electors and the electoral college and deciding who will have the presidency. It failed in 2020, but if this version of it is adopted, it has the chance of succeeding where state legislature can totally ignore the popular vote. On the other track,
before you go to the next track, just want to interject that again, all the messaging up until last Tuesday about why it was important to vote, there were nearly 300 election deniers, many of whom won office this week, and some of them running for Secretary of State. So as you say, all not accidental, it's part of this larger plan. So I didn't want to leave that first track before making that point, because now we get to have to plan in the wake of an election where there are now election deniers who will be put in place to be able to do this kind of work. But go ahead, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, so the first track is the elections, what we're going to talk about now. The second track was the electors, who's going to decide the presidency in the electoral college. But the bottom line is this will give, it is even more pernicious because when you read it against the other cases that are taking place, there was a case that people really talk about. It went under the radar, the Rucho case of 2019, where the Supreme Court just threw up his hands and said the federal judiciary does not weigh in on partisan gerrymandering. And so therefore, this is a Section 2 case under the Voter Rights Act. And we were set up because before, when they gutted section in 2013, when they gutted section 4 and basically nullified section 5, which is pre-clearance, where states that had a history of discriminating had to get reviewed by the federal government. The John Roberts said, hey, you all have section 2. This is a second section 2 case that they're basically through the pen eliminating the Voter Rights Act in effect. And so so if you're saying the federal judiciary is not going to deal with partisan gerrymandering, and now this is the bookend. Now it's cutting out state courts from dealing with partisan gerrymandering. So what this means is that the Republican-controlled legislatures can set up any rules for elections, and the state constitution can't check them. The state judiciary or the state judges can't check them. And the federal government basically is virtually saying, well, we're not going to deal with partisan gerrymandering.
Right. And there's a racial component as well. So, all of these cases I think that we're going to talk about today show the undoing of Reconstruction. I mean, this is all part of that larger plan, as you mentioned, Greg. This is a chess game. So as Valethia just said, you have the Rucho case where Kagan, in her dissent, essentially said this will irreparably damage our system of government. And she was right. We have the racial side of this too. So we already talked about how partisan gerrymandering is going to affect and does affect Black people. We also have the Voting Rights Act, which Valethia just mentioned, which just prohibits discrimination in voting, racial discrimination. So you don't have pre-clearance anymore. Merrill versus Milligan, they're about to just disable Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Case with they're going back to the well, as Valethia said. 2013, they were in Alabama for Shelby County, and they're coming back to Alabama.
Exactly. Now, state constitutions can and do often prohibit racial discrimination in voting. So even if you were to remove the VRA, some states can go further than the VRA and establish protections. Problem is, with this case, which is ostensibly focused only on partisan gerrymandering, it affects that as well, because now the state courts cannot interpret what the state legislature is doing when they draw these messed up maps. It cannot say, hey, you violated our state constitution.
Let me pause there, because we're going to break. When we come back, Angie, if you can pick up right there, because that really reinforces what you said. This is the bookend to what they started with Shelby County. This is a chess game. Let's pause here just for a minute. Here at the Black Star Network with the Black Table, our legal roundtable, I think everyone can see why this conversation is one we had to extend over from last week. So we'll be back in a moment here at the Black Table.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase, and I'm here with a very important message. We are at a turning point in the Black community where we must have equity in the apps we use that scale to billions of dollars. But this time, we own the infrastructure, we own the culture, and we shape the future. And Fanbase is the future. Fanbase combines the free functionality of Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube into an all-in-one platform built for the evolution of social media and monetization. With over 1.4 million users, that's real proof that we are shifting the conversation of tech ownership and equity for creators. So right now, I want you to go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest today. The minimum to invest is $399. That gets you 60 shares of stock in Fanbase at $665 a share. This marks a turning point in Black ownership of social media. If we don't take this opportunity to own social media right now, we will always be customers to our own creations. And that can't go on. So once again, go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest today. We must own the platforms where our voices live, our stories matter, and where our culture drives the world. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Black Table. Greg Carr here, your host on the Black Star Network. We're joined with our regular legal roundtable, Angi Porter and Valethia Watkins. Angi, please continue your thought. I just wanted to pause there. We had to take a break. Keep going, please. This in this bookend in this Alabama case where now you're saying that, okay, you can enshrine in the state constitution
Yeah.
that you can't discriminate. But
Yes,
now the Supreme Court taking the state courts out of being able to interpret what the state constitution is. I thought that was the point of having a state court.
Right.
Federalism.
So the states can go further, is what I'm saying. So, they take away the VRA, which is what they're trying to do. States have constitutions that also prohibit discrimination in voting. You take the state judiciary out of that, the legislature has free reign to do what it wants to do. Okay, so then what other options do we have? Congress can try to pass statutes, and it has tried to pass statutes to prohibit partisan gerrymandering. That's what they did with the For the People Act. That got caught up by the filibuster. Sinema and Manchin and them said they don't want to get rid of that. So you have past week, people said you need to vote to give the Democrats enough people to be able to pass the For the People Act. Right. And so they could do that. They could also do another VRA-esque type statute to prohibit racial gerrymandering. But guess what? The maps have been drawn. Congress is the result of gerrymandering. Therefore, it's checkmate. This is essentially a subversive repeal of the 15th Amendment. This is what I'm saying. They are undoing Reconstruction.
And let me give a point of correction for myself. The Moore v. Harper, which is in North Carolina, is that independent state legislature claim, but it is Murrow versus Milliken that is the Section 2 of the Voter Rights Act. They already did shenanigans. Let's go back to when it went before the state Supreme Court or the federal bench. 3 judges decided that map was discriminatory. And then instead of creating a fair map, the state of Alabama ran to the Supreme Court under the shadow docket. And the Supreme Court said, hey, we don't have enough time. Now, this is February 2022. We don't have enough time to change the map. Let's let the map that they had, the discriminatory map, go forward for the election that's already taken place. So they already got one bite at the apple to use discriminatory map that even Trump judges said was racially discriminatory.
9 months is enough time to conceive, bring to term, and give birth to a baby. Of course, if the Supreme Court has its way, it would be illegal for a woman not to be pregnant. But it's not enough time to redraw a map.
Yeah.
With computers. That was the pretext. That was the computers.
They could do it in 2 weeks, they said. They could do it in 2 weeks.
That's what they said. That's what the bench said now. But then the Supreme Court jumps in. Says, no. We've got a larger project here. Leave those maps in place. We're trying to lock in white minority rule in Alabama.
And the other thing is the Alabama was arguing that they can make racially neutral maps. Really subverting what the Congress has said, that you don't have to, because if they do that and adopt what they're saying, then you got to prove intentional discrimination. And Congress had already said under Section 2, they wrote Section 2 and said, no, we have to look at discriminatory effect, not intent.
For the non-lawyers, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which was passed through and signed into law in the federal government 1965 as part of the second Reconstruction, meant to make the first Reconstruction stand up. And at this point, whether it be the Federalist Society or the white nationalists now cemented in the Republican Party, have been engaged in a 50-year war, not only to gut and neutralize the Voting Rights Act, but as you say, Angi, literally to subvert a basic repeal of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution.
The VRA is an enforcing statute of the 15th Amendment.
Right.
The 15th Amendment says, Congress, you can enforce this amendment by passing legislation. And one of those pieces of legislation is the VRA. So all of this goes back to the 15th. It's the undoing of Reconstruction.
And also for those who just on my little sad side, for those who were siding with the feminists who didn't want the 15th Amendment passed because they said it didn't cover women, then you would not even had the firewall that we had for the pretext of a firewall that we've had, and you would not have been able to have the Voter Rights Act, which covers Black women and Black men and others.
So, all right, so help us now. So we're seeing, in fact, now in December, coming up in a few weeks, this North Carolina case where you're saying even if the states have enshrined in their state constitutions a state version of the 15th Amendment, the United States Supreme Court, reaching into the affairs of states, as you say, Valethia, into the federalist framework, this dual federalist framework, are now trying to take the state courts out of their clear responsibility of interpreting what their state constitutions say. How's that possible? You said it was radical, but I'm trying to, I'm sure people scratching their heads and saying, wait a minute, the state constitution should be interpreted by the state Supreme Court, right? Yeah. So what does the federal government have to do with it? What does the Supreme Court have to do with interpreting that? How does that even work?
They've taken themselves out. This is a chess game. They've taken themselves out. What
they're concentrating power in the hands of partisan GOP-controlled legislature. And so ultimately, this is the politician picking their voters, not the voters picking politicians. And it is going to be sham elections because they are going to be the final arbiter of what the rules are. So if they want to wipe out early voting, if they want to close polling places, if they want to do a lot of the things that they have been trying to do, they are closing off many different avenues to be able to check that.
Yes, and the drawing of the maps, the very districts to which you belong when you go to the polling place. That's what the legislature does. And they draw it for the state offices and for Congress.
So let me ask both of you. You're in a state where you've got this white nationalist impulse and their control of the state legislature, and they do this. Isn't there a governor in these states? Aren't there secretaries of state? Again, people say, why vote? Why not vote? A lot of election deniers.
Oh, yeah.
On the ballot, and who are running for Secretary of State, who ran for Secretary of State. So if you're a governor or a Secretary of State that does not agree with this, and what's your role in it?
Like in Wisconsin, that just happened in Wisconsin. The governor called out the map. Yeah, this independent state legislature theory says both the judiciary and the executive are removed from the equation.
They're removing the elected governor.
Yeah.
Only the legislature. Okay, so where are they getting the language to even try this?
The Elections Clause, Article 1 of the Constitution.
United States Constitution.
U.S. Constitution, yep. And so this is, as Valethia mentioned, this has been around since the Constitution, and it has never been interpreted this way. This is a fringe theory.
Do you have it? Do y'all have it at hand? Because we have the one of the best men in the business in Brother Keenan, who might.
I got it.
As I said, Keenan might put the language up for us.
I got it. I can read it. Keenan, you go right ahead. Do your magic.
But go ahead. What does it say?
So this is the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1. Elections Clause. The time, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives, that's the U.S. Congress, shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. Congress also can override that, hence, the For the People Act that didn't get passed. But
Congress could do it, but they're locked in gerrymandered districts by people who have put themselves in power. So they're saying because the word governor or executive doesn't appear in that clause, there's no role for state governors, role.
You have 19th century scholars, legal scholars are saying, but what that word legislature was understood to mean. Also, what they're doing is a radical departure from that, because you're talking about 200 years of precedent, which basically interpreted that the state legislature is a creature of state constitutions, and state judges are there to interpret state constitution.
Right.
So it's not a literal legislature and nobody else because you don't see the word. The legislatures were understood in a much broader sense.
Yeah, the legislature is understood to be the whole state lawmaking apparatus. Because, by the way, the idea of judicial review and courts looking at law to determine and interpret what the law means, that comes later than the Constitution. That develops in Supreme Court jurisprudence. The Supreme Court says, oh yeah, we as the court can interpret the law. That kind of develops later. So that's why these scholars are saying, yeah, you're imputing this old, you're imputing a very old way of looking at this when the understanding is that there are checks and balances.
We know that folk like Samuel Alito love going back into history and rewriting history. So we can all probably assume that Ketanji Onyeka Brown Jackson, Sonia Sotomayor, and Atlanta Kagan's clerks are busy right now preparing their justices to argue, looking through the legislative record in those state legislatures to make the very point you all are making. I'm assuming we can probably expect that another hot bench, as you all might say in the legal profession, another hot bench as Ketanji Justice Brown Jackson gets ready to quiz them on whether or not they even read the debates that took place in the legislature that led to those clauses and to the U.S. Constitution for that matter. Let's take a break. We want to pause here for a moment so we can spend a little bit more time in our next block talking about finishing up, kind of tying up the back end of Moore versus Harper, this case on the independent state legislature in North Carolina, and then introducing several more cases, one of which has been argued in the week since we did our first conversation in this sequence, and the federal election that took place this week. And there will be it was argued actually on election day. That's one of the cases we'll be talking about when we come back in a moment here at the Black Table. Back in a moment.
Violent white supremacy is, quote, the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland.
The greatest terrorist threat to the homeland is the homegrown violent restraint, including hate crime committed on behalf of some kind of white supremacist ideology.
They are coming after everything in Black America. MAGA and Donald Trump are specifically targeting Black America. They are going after the money. Attack Black Lives Matter. Attack critical race theory, attack woke, DEI. MAGA wants to defund Black America. This is a perfect example of their desire to completely degrade and de-emphasize Black people.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Remember to support the Black Star Network. Download the app, tell your friends. This is independent, Black-owned, Black-controlled media. And as our founder and guiding light, Roland Martin, always reminds us, you can't be Black news media and be scared. So with that in mind, we have two of the most fearless scholars we have, Valethia Watkins and Angela Porter. Any final thoughts on this independent state legislature theory? Do they have the votes? Do they have the votes to make this argument? This leader of the North Carolina rogue legislature who has bypassed the Secretary of State, bypassed the governor, trying to bypass the Supreme Court of the state of North Carolina and talk to his friends on the Supreme Court of the United States. Do they have the votes for this?
Oh yeah, they need 5. Thomas was in the dissent or in the concurrence rather in Bush v. Gore, where they entertained this theory. You got Chief Justice Roberts, who I think argued in Bush v. Gore, where they asserted this theory. Kavanaugh, he's like caught on tape talking about this theory. He also was on that litigation team. Coney Barrett, she was on a team where, because for legal reasons, they didn't argue. They actually argued against this theory. It was related to Bush v. Gore, but she gonna flip because in her confirmation hearing, she played coy about that and said she didn't even remember what she did. All they need is what, Gorsuch? Gorsuch, Who's Alito? That's all they need. And
if you all remember, we talked about this a little bit during the election that put Joe Biden in office. Alito was making arguments in that Pennsylvania case where they were trying the Pennsylvania legislature trying to end around the governor and throw out all those votes from places like Philadelphia by saying that the governor illegally expanded access to the ballot during COVID and passed all this, gave these policies. And they said nobody's vote should be counted that came in, even if it was postmarked before Election Day, after Election Day. And Sam Alito, writing from the bench, was hot for that idea. He is a proponent of the independent state legislature. He was going to give the Pennsylvania legislature that ability. So you're saying this isn't going to be a wild theory. This is probably going to happen, huh?
Yeah.
Well, here we are. Reconstruction again. No, redemption, I guess. We're in the redemption phase.
Yeah, the nadir.
The nadir. Oh, bringing back the good, Rayford Logan. Yes, indeed. Those y'all go look that up. The Betrayal of the Negro, as he got renamed by Professor Rayford Logan, writing about that period in the 19th century, since we seem to be coming back to that. So what else is this Supreme Court up to this term, professors? Is something happened this week? An argument involving maybe healthcare, or what else is going on?
Yeah, so there's a case called Health and Hospital Corporation versus Televitsky, and this case represents a serious threat to the social safety net. It's a Medicaid case where the hospital corporation is asking the Supreme Court to strip Medicaid patients of their ability to enforce their rights through private lawsuits. Meaning that if a patient believes that their rights have been violated, they can sue the alleged violator. And so under Section 1983 of U.S. Code 42, lawyers refer to it as Section 1983. That law permits state officials to be sued in federal court if they deprive someone, and this is quote unquote, any rights, privileges, or immunity secured by the Constitution, and a key point, and laws. So these Medicaid laws. So the Supreme Court has long held that this law permits private lawsuits to enforce Medicaid. So if there are grave consequences, if they strip enforcement away through private lawsuits, one of the consequences and the significance, this is an attack on an administrative state, but this is a conditional grant of,
which is one of their larger objectives. They want to destroy the administrative apparatus in the federal government.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so they want to, this is a conditional grant of funds to states under the fact that they have to accept certain conditions, an enormous amount of money through Medicaid, for example. And they have to ensure that they're gonna, certain safeguards of quality of care, certain safeguard that certain people would be covered. And so basically, if you strip away private lawsuits to enforce this, there are limited things that the government can do but they don't really have the infrastructure to individual cases. So
that was the whole point for those folks who are non-lawyers. Wasn't that the whole point of Section 1983, to provide individuals with the apparatus to protect themselves, because the federal government simply doesn't have that kind of muscle to file all the cases.
Right. And so the only remedy the primary remedy would be either to cut all or some of the funds. So ultimately that means the poor, the low income, the Medicaid patients would be punished for state misconduct. And so ultimately what this is, remember what's on the ballot is that Republicans want to cut Social Security. They want to cut what they call entitlements in a derogatory way. They want to cut Medicaid. And so this would be a way for them to not comply with federal regulations and laws and tip the federal government to punish them, which would allow them to cut Medicaid without their fingerprints being on it. In other words, they wouldn't have to pass a law and go on the record, and it would be very unpopular if they voted to cut Medicaid. So this is a backdoor way to cut these so-called entitlement programs.
So Rick Scott, Senator Rick Scott out of Florida, who has engorged himself by the hundreds of millions of dollars from Medicaid fraud, is probably cheering at the idea that he won't even have to do that much now. I mean, they can kick the teeth out of this. Go ahead, Angie, please.
Well, and again, this is all the undoing of Reconstruction. Section 1983, 42 USC Section 1983 is part of the Ku Klux Klan Act.
Come on now.
The act established in 1871 during Reconstruction. The whole point of the KKK Act is because because state actors, whether they're implementing federal programs or not, state actors are terrorizing Black people. And so as a way to check that, as Valethia said, instead of the federal government needs some help, they're allowing a private right of action. This, by the way, is the most used civil rights apparatus in law.
Well,
all the cases, police shootings of unarmed Black people, always they will have a civil case. And that civil case is the family suing under Section 1983 because they're suing state actors, police.
This is a critical point because so when we see Ben Crump call a press conference, he's not calling a press conference on the criminal side. You got to go for George Floyd. You got to go to the Attorney General. You got to go Keith Ellison for that. If you're talking about money, this is the money section. This is what you're talking about. This is these are the settlements. This is when the people, families say, interesting.
This is that. There's often a parallel civil case to a criminal case. And so if you have a state actor like police, like people administering this program, like public school teachers, and they have violated your constitutional rights, you can file a Section 1983 claim. And again, it all comes from Reconstruction. So now we see the court in its grand mission, and the people on the right, and their grand mission to dismantle Reconstruction, to make America great again, meaning take it before the Civil War. They're attacking it on all fronts. We're in a full frontal attack, a full frontal assault.
A comprehensive attack on every level. And these are the same people who wouldn't take take money from the federal government under the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, to expand Medicaid. That's how much and that was free money from the federal government to the state.
It wasn't free money. We paid our taxes.
Right, but the state wasn't on the hook. The state had access to help the poor, and then you get and you need safeguards. Think about what happened with Brett Favre in Mississippi getting this kind of money to help the poor. So this is a very consequential case.
So okay, actually that's very good because so many folk who are now learning for the first time how the law is operating in these areas certainly were aware that Brett Favre stole money. That's all they know. But you're saying that the Brett Favre situation in Mississippi is an example of what we're talking about the Supreme Court getting ready to enable?
Right, because there are safeguards, and so and with the safeguards they were able to violate. And then when people were trying to investigate, the investigator was fired because he got too close to what was going on. Taking away this private ability to sue would just is either take away all the money. It's a blunt instrument what the federal government could do to punish. So again, this is insulating the states from accountability.
My God.
And this is nursing home. Many people have relatives in a nursing home. This is a nursing home patient that was drugged and they felt their rights were violated. They were drugged in a way. They have since passed, but their estate is suing because they were drugged in a way with psychotropic drugs to make them docile and to not have to really deal with them and not for legitimate medical reasons. And
so help me with this, and I know we don't have much more time in this block, and maybe we can squeeze one more case in our final block, and you all can choose whichever direction you want to go in, of course. And we're going to, of course, have to continue this conversation in another quickly convened at some point in the next few weeks legal roundtable. But when you start talking like that, I'm thinking about people who will literally have no recourse, who will be vulnerable. But in looking at the filing, when you look at Supreme Court docket, one of the phrases I saw bandied about was there's compelling historical evidence to the contrary, meaning, are we liable to see this court say, like they did in the Dobbs case, oh no, the historical record shows that, no, this is not how 1983 was supposed to be used. I
mean, they cherry pick history to this is a results-oriented court. I mean, I have students who have an existential crisis when they learn that the court is just going on their whim, and they're going to use history to reach the result they want. And so it's not, there's no neutrality in this. History is always told from a center. It always has some agenda, the narrative choices.
We'll take a break here with re-articulation from Professor Angela Porter of what we might call the Porter Doctrine of the nonsense framework. Many of you all responded to that last week. He said, this is the nonsense framework of statutory interpretation. But at any rate, we're going to come back in a moment here at the Black Table with our regular legal round table, Professors Valethia, Watkins, and Angela Porter, so we can wrap up this section and move forward as we think about what all of this means for us. Back in a moment.
They said the quiet part out loud. Black votes are a threat, so they erased them. After the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, Republican legislatures moved fast. New voter ID laws, polling place shutdowns, purges of black voters from the rolls. Trump's Justice Department didn't stop it, they joined in. In 2018, his DOJ backed Ohio's voter purge system, a scheme that disproportionately erased black voters. Their goal, erase black votes and political power. Yeah, that happened. These are the kinds of stories that we cover every day on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Subscribe on YouTube and download the Black Star Network app. Support fact-based independent journalism that centers African Americans and the issues that matter to our community.
Welcome back to the Black Table. This is our hour we regularly devote to issues of special concern, not only to people of African descent, but really should be to everybody. Here on the Black Star Network, remember to support the Black Star Network. We have our regular legal roundtable with Professors Angela Porter and Valethia Watkins. Angie, there's a case on the docket involving the indigenous people of this country. And it looks like the Supreme Court, having had a bite at the apple with adoptive couple versus baby girl, are going to come back around and once again question whether the children of indigenous people should find homes with with other indigenous people. I mean, what is this Holland case, Holland versus Bracken?
Yeah, this case, I mean, this is totally related to us too, as Black people, because it's similar logic to the SFFA case, where they're essentially critiquing this notion of race, and they're turning equal protection clause on its head. In SFFA, it's the 14th Amendment. In this case, it's the 5th Amendment for reasons that we don't need to get too deep into. But essentially—
you should mention it because we talked about it last week. The 5th Amendment is what is used to engage and interact with the indigenous people of this country. Is that right?
That's correct, because matters involving indigenous people fall under the Department of the Interior, which is a federal entity. So the 5th Amendment applies to the federal government, 14th Amendment applies to the states. So,
Okay.
but it's the same analysis, essentially.
They don't fit in that category. Adding another layer of irony, given the fact that an indigenous woman, Deborah Holland, is now the Secretary of the
Right.
So,
Right. But really quick, just to tee up the facts there so we can discuss it. We have a white couple in Texas wanting to adopt a child. She's now 4 years old, who was born to a mother in the Navajo Nation. And we have the Indian Child Welfare Act, which says, based on all the wisdom of time and history, that the best interests of the child born who is eligible to be a member of a tribal nation, sovereign nation, is to be adopted by a family in that tribal affiliation. Because again, history, we had forced assimilation of indigenous children in this country's history, and a full-on assault on indigenous culture. So it's a no-brainer. But now this couple wants to adopt this child and is putting the entire premise of ICWA on the chopping block.
Is there any, why this renewed assault on Indigenous communities? I mean, what is the precedent? We see a string of betrayals in terms of the broken promises of treaties. We've seen in the last several terms of the court this question of indigeneity and authority coming back over and over again, whether it be those cases out of Oklahoma or McGirt. I mean, who has authority, who has the ability to enforce the law on Indian reservations? But, why do you think, Valethia, why are we seeing the court not only accept this case, but engaging again in this attempt to diminish the authority of Native people to live their lives, define who and what is part of their communities? Why again?
Well, this case is not just organically coming to the fore. The Goldwater Institute, a conservative institute, the conservatives in conjunction with evangelical Christians have systematically attacked the sovereignty of Indigenous people, and they are systematically attacking ICWA. And so the bottom line is, this claim is tied, like Professor Porter said, to us, because they're saying it is racial discrimination and giving racial preferences for the Native people against white people. And the key point is racializing the Indigenous people. The lower court argued that Indian identity is not a race. They're not a race. It is a political status. They are a nation or nations of people. And so the 14th Amendment doesn't apply to this case in the sense of racial discrimination. What it is doing is opening up, if they find on 14th Amendment grounds, it's opening up a reexamination of the sovereignty rights of these treaties of the nation to make independent decisions. And I think what is actually behind it is these casinos and the land that certain conservative interests want to drill, that the water protectors and other Native peoples are preventing them from drilling for oil and getting casinos. And this case would allow that to say, oh, under the 14th Amendment, it's racial discrimination. We can reexamine all of these things again.
That is remarkable. That's truly remarkable when we think about that in the context of the level of scrutiny that's supposed to be used in a case like this. And in fact, I don't know if either you might want to comment on that as it relates to this case in particular with the Indian Child Welfare Act, and why, for example, strict scrutiny wouldn't be used on this case. Or would strict scrutiny be used? I don't know if either of you all have any thoughts about that.
Well, before I would give that to Professor Porter, but I at least want to say I implore everybody in this audience to just go on YouTube and look at the dark and ugly history over a century of removing their children systematically from them. And then that's with the boarding schools, which were not schools. They were torture chambers. And there just was a federal report ordered by Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Interior, that found over 500 graves. And they think there are more deaths related to what was happening at these schools on top of the abuse or whatever. And then in the 1950s, they did forced adoptions. And now in current time, they're disproportionately systematically removing their children. This is stripping them of their future, because you're taking away their cultural identity. You're severing ties to their language, their history, their culture. This is an ugly history.
I mean, it's interesting. It's almost as if, and certainly being driven by commercial interests, as you say, you start talking about casino, you start talking about trying to drill and access other natural resources, water. It's almost as if conceptually, this is an attempt to finish the job of settler colonialism. Is that overstating the case? I mean, you want to destroy. I mean, that's why I found it interesting thinking about this case. The question of, if it's dealing with race, then, the law has to be pursued with strict scrutiny. But when you start talking about other categories, I mean, why is this a rational basis case, Professor Porter?
Well, they want it to be a race case. I mean, that's the argument. They want it to be a race case. So essentially the 14th, the 5th, the equal protection clauses of those amendments, they are based on this notion of race. And they've flipped these things on their head, the right-wing activists who are arguing these cases, so that racial classifications, any racial classifications, are impermissible, even those meant to benefit folks who have been oppressed based on racial constructs. And so they have this very destructive black hole. Anything mentioning race and touching race is impermissible. And now the real pernicious part, they're expanding that black hole to include things like tribal affiliation. That's their goal. And they're not going to stop at that. They want to include things like, if you listen to the argument in SFFA, whether you're a descendant of slaves, they say that's a proxy for race. Everything is now becoming this proxy for race, which is becoming a curse word in Supreme Court jurisprudence. And so if even history and culture are getting brought into race.
But right. Look at the invisibleness of whiteness. So under SFA, they can look for rural, they can recruit rural, and rural
right.
equals white. But if they say urban, that's impermissible because that's a proxy for
exactly.
race.
And everything's a proxy for whiteness.
Right. Right. Whiteness is raceless and invisible.
It's John Roberts' disturbing and bizarre fascination with what percentage of the Indian blood makes you Indian in adoptive couple versus baby girl. This man is obsessed with race. So, but apparently they've got the numbers. They can count. So they can ready to run the table, the white table. But that's why we have the black table.
Right. So and you're moving with, I mean, the thing is the facade is off. You know, it's supposed to be incremental. They're overturning half a century precedent in every area. And this is really the implementation of the Republican agenda at lightning speed. So they're not even pretending to do judicial analysis. It is just straight, raw, naked power.
Wow. So maybe in 30 seconds, Professor Porter, Angie, you might want to offer a comment on what we just heard Valethia say, Professor Watkins say. So what does this mean? What is the implication? Can they break judicial supremacy and the rule of law in the country by superheating it, by moving so fast at this point? Or how should we even be thinking about this system? Maybe in conclusion.
Yeah, well, I think we all could probably agree this system is not for us. It never was. And it's arising out of a particular history and tradition, whiteness and the West. And therefore, we should not look at it as if it is inherently correct, as though it inherently makes sense. It is nonsense, and we need to be challenging it on that basis. I'll just end by saying, the lawyers who argued Brown, if we're going to operate within this system, they challenged the very premise of what the Supreme Court had done up to that point. And that's the level we have to have this conversation on.
Yes. Well, thank you both. Thank you for responding so quickly to viewership, and thank our producers. Joe, thank you for getting the crew back together for this roundtable so quickly. And in between, we had a whole election. And when I come back in a moment, we'll clear the table and we'll talk about that in the context of what has happened this week and what we now can look forward to over the next several months. Back at the Black Table in a moment.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase, and I'm here with a very important message. We are at a turning point in the Black community where we must have equity in the apps we use that scale to billions of dollars. But this time, we own the infrastructure, we own the culture, and we shape the future. And Fanbase is the future. Fanbase combines the free functionality of Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube into an all-in-one platform built for the evolution of social media and monetization. With over 1.4 million users, that's real proof that we are shifting the conversation of tech ownership and equity for creators. So right now, I want you to go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest today. The minimum to invest is $399. That gets you 60 shares of stock in Fanbase at $665 a share. This marks a turning point in Black ownership of social media. If we don't take this opportunity to own social media right now, we will always be customers to our own creations. And that can't go on. So once again, go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest today. We must own the platforms where our voices live, our stories matter, and where our culture drives the world. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Remember to tell your friends, download the app, and continue to track the Black Table and all of our shows on the Black Star Network across all platforms. Glad to have you with us. So as we just heard Professors Angela Porter and Valethia Watkins talk about, we are now looking at the federal judiciary as completing the unfinished work of making America great again, returning it to a white republic, albeit a very changed America from when that idea was launched in the 18th century, a very different United States of America demographically, a very different United States of America politically, but seems like that old framework is going to have one last great walk in the sun, perhaps before it implodes. So we're reminded in this moment, in the wake of a federal election, and with the court cases that we have just heard discussed on the docket, and more to come, as we're going to have to reconvene this roundtable as we look to the federal bench, we are reminded by Dr. Frank Smith, director of the United States Civil War Museum, the African American Civil War Museum here in Washington, D.C., and a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee who put his life on the line in his 20s, along with many other women and men, not only of African descent, but white Americans as well, and others. He reminds us that all we do after an election is get our marching orders on what the results of that election tell us we have to make adjustments in to move forward, because at the center of any oppression is resistance, and this resistance must persist. So those of you young people who are thinking about going to law school, we need you, because the federal bench ain't gonna stay the same always. Those of you who are thinking of running for office, you should do that. At the local level, the state level, the federal level, you should do that. Those of you who are sick of politics and want something to change, wake up, look in the mirror, and understand, as Professor Porter and Professor Watkins have reminded us today, we've been here before. We've been here before. And that's why we have to study what we did the last time so we can make the adjustments and win again, as Marvin Gaye would say. We get up, we win, we go to sleep, we wake up, we win again. So don't be discouraged. Welcome next week. We'll welcome new guests and conversations here at the Black Table, and we'll see you all next week right back here on the Black Star Network.